I am a research associate professor at the University of Virginia. And over the past year and a half, we've been working quite a bit on COVID-19. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. It's work done with a large group of people. These are all colleagues at my institute. And we've done computational epidemiology for a number of years. So we've all been working together on COVID-19, so modeling and intervention and things like that. For the work today, I want to mention special thanks to Zakaria Mehrab, Aniruddha Adiga, Srini Venkatramanan, and Madhav Marathi. All right, so when the epidemic started, one of the things about this epidemic that was different from previous ones was the availability of data. So in past epidemics, we even struggled to find case counts at a reasonable, frequency. But with this time, this dashboard was created by some of my colleagues in January, late January of 2020, within like a couple of weeks. And we were getting case data from all over the world, so we could track it in this way. We were getting, confirmed cases, deaths, estimates of recovered people. And as time went on, people started doing surveys about behavior and getting biological data and mobility data and all kinds of things. So it was really great in terms of data availability this time around. But what we discovered was that some, these data are really quite complicated and not easy to work with. And here are some kinds of questions that we typically like to be able to answer. And there are state estimation type questions, like how many people are actually infected. This is a big problem with COVID because a lot of people, like 40% of cases, can be asymptomatic or very mildly symptomatic. And we didn't have good testing capability early in the epidemic. So testing policies really impacted our estimates of how many people are infected. In some places, it is possible to do prevalence testing, where you actually randomly sample the population to see how many people are infected, but that's quite rare relatively. So testing still focuses on people who show up with symptoms and then the contacts of those people. That's called contact tracing and so forth. So that makes it difficult to estimate how many people are actually infected. And then how many people are complying with interventions, how many variants are circulating, how much immunity does the population have, because immunity wanes over time, and that can cause a resurgence in the epidemic and so forth. So those types of questions are difficult to answer. And we're also interested in forecasting, like, will there be a surge in cases in the future? What is the hospital capacity needed? And what can we do about it? How much contact tracing do we need to do? What should be the vaccine allocation strategy? What non-pharmaceutical intervention should be instituted? And then when all is said and done, we also like to be able to answer some counterfactual questions. How bad would the epidemic have been, let's say, without airport closures or without school closures? Did we do the right thing or not? Right? So all kinds of questions come up. We've been working on a number of these questions, and there are papers that I can point you to for anybody who's interested. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is something relatively simple, because in this process, we started working with some mobility data, and we found that the impact of mobility on cases is quite complicated. We don't really understand it. And so can we even quantify what is the effect of human mobility on the evolution of the epidemic, on the number of cases? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the kind of mobility data we're looking at is cell phone-based mobility traces. I would say that, for computational epidemiology, this has been the big new development with this epidemic, that these kinds of mobility data are becoming available and are starting to be used in epidemic modeling. So what are these data? They are pings from people's cell phones. So they give you a latitude and longitude with some kind of error around it, like maybe a 20-meter resolution. And there are multiple providers who are generating these kinds of data. So here are some of them. And some, have released some data sort of in the public interest to researchers. Some are commercial entities, and you have to buy data from them and so forth. And they are aggregated, anonymized, or some kind of processing is done to preserve privacy in various ways. So you all might have seen things like the Google mobility reports, where they say, at a very aggregate level, they say how much has mobility changed with respect to some kind of baseline. And at parks or at transit stations or workplaces or grocery stores and so forth, are people going there more or less, and how much? Right? Then there was Cubic, which is a company that does this kind of mobility tracking, and they release quite a bit of data free to researchers, and they produce their mobility index trends. The particular mobility data I'm going to talk about today is from a company called Xmode. And from Xmode, we got a fairly large data set. It's about 4 billion pings, or individual records, per day that come from about 20 million unique users per day globally. About half of those are in the US. And it's about 1.2 terabytes of data per day. So it takes some doing to even work with it. That was a learning experience for us. And it has about a 20-meter accuracy. So when you get a latitude, longitude, they say that the person is somewhere in a 20-meter radius of this. And there's no more information than that. So we don't know if they're more likely to be in the middle or anything like that. And there are no demographics provided with the data. So really all it is a bunch of pings, like there's somebody here and somebody here and somebody here. And there's a user ID that connects people, the pings. So for a person that they were seen in particular locations during a day, but there's no guaranteed frequency of sampling. So one day from somebody, you might get 1 ping, and another day you might get 100. You just don't know how much data you're missing. And we don't know what kind of a sample it is of the population. It is certainly not a uniform sample of the population. There is a heavy demographic skew in it, and we think it's more towards younger people, young adults, maybe people in their 20s and so forth. But from the company, we have no information about what the demographics are. So you can imagine it's, there's a lot of data, but it has these unknown biases, and it's noisy, and it's not quite clear what to do with it. So people have tried using it in various ways, and some nice papers have come out on some similar data sets. But still, when we actually, really try to do some forecasting, it turns out to be very difficult. So, for example, here's just so you can see, here's a heat map of what the data look like, and it's aggregated to 1 degree latitude, longitude cells, and the scale is in thousands, I think. So this is 1 day of data, and it's thousands or tens of thousands of pings from each cell. And you can see where it's concentrated. There's all kinds of interesting things. You can see that there's somebody on a flight over here. And there are some areas where there's much less data than the population, like in China, very low coverage. But you can see, desert regions, and you can see highly populated regions. You can see a lot of people in the ocean, in vessels on the ocean, and all kinds of things. So you can spend a lot of time staring at the data. It's very interesting. But here's what we do with it. So first, we do some stop point detection. So we can actually look at their standard algorithms for stop point detection, which basically looks at the interval between pings and looks at the distance between pings and tries to figure out where a person is just sort of moving along, like in a vehicle or something, and where they might have actually stopped, and so potentially interacted with other people. Right? And so we use a standard stop point detection algorithm and find stop points from the trajectories of individual users. And then we compute interaction counts. So if 2 pings occur within distance d and time t, we call that an interaction. And then we can count the number of interactions and do more things with it. So the thresholds we chose are time of 1 hour and a distance of, I think it was 2 meters, right? So they have to be quite close to each other, because otherwise maybe the interaction doesn't really affect, disease transmission. Then once we have the interactions, we can compute a lot of graph-based interaction measures. So we look at a sliding window over time, and we say within this time window, let's construct the graph of users who are interacting with each other. And from that, we can derive a number of measures, like the number of connected components in the graph, the number of k-cores on the graph with a certain k, and the highest degree in the k-core, or the total number of edges in the k-core, and so forth. So for a high-level picture, it's not really important what exactly are the metrics, but we can derive a number of these. Okay. So then we looked at 50 different counties in the US. And these are counties corresponding to land-grant universities. So you can think of that as being the major state university in each state in the US. And the reason to look at these was that we saw from the data, sort of anecdotally, that as students came back to campus in the fall of 2020, in many cases, there were surges in the number of COVID cases shortly afterwards. And then these cases would also spread into the community. So in the county as a whole, there would be a surge in cases shortly after that. And it's because younger people coming back to school all like to interact with each other and have parties and things, I suppose. So that's why probably it's happening. But it would be nice to be able to get some kind of early warning if there's going to be a surge based on these mobility data. And so we look at those graph metrics and we try to do just a correlation here with the case data that we have from each of these counties. And what we're seeing here is the scale, which is the population. That's the color coding, sorry. And then the size of the dot tells you how strong the correlation is. And this is the correlation with, this is the best correlation we could get with any one of the graph measures that we computed in the previous step, right? So it's different for different counties. Some graph measure works well for some and another for another. And something that's interesting here is that in the top right here, which is the northeast of the country, we don't get good results at all. And this is interesting because this is where the response was the strongest. I don't know if you all remember this very well, but in New York, there was a large number of cases and they completely locked down the place early on, and they really instituted pretty strong measures for keeping people apart and wearing masks and things like that. And so obviously, if people are being more cognizant about avoiding this transmission of the disease, then even if they're interacting more, maybe the transmission is less. And so the mobility is not predictive of the number of cases. So it's interesting that it's sort of localized in the Northeast. And what we find is that the areas with the smaller populations tend to have a higher correlation with these mobility measures. Whereas and those tend to be the more rural counties. A lot of the state universities are in small college towns sort of far away from anything else. The ones which are in more urban areas show smaller correlation with the measure. So that's another interesting finding. So now the question is, what can we say about how much this mobility is actually contributing to the number of cases? So this is just a correlation. Can we sort of tease this out a little bit better? And what we did was something relatively straightforward. We take a standard SEIR model of epidemic transmission. If you're not familiar with this, it just divides the population into 4 compartments: susceptible, exposed, infectious, and recovered, and has this classic ordinary differential equation form for the model. And what we do here is that there are only 3 parameters. There is beta, which is the transmissibility, sigma, which is the latency period, and gamma, the recovery rate. And sigma and gamma we set based on the best available data from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Transmission. And beta, the transmissibility, is what we calibrate. So it's a time-varying parameter for us, and it is dependent on the number of contacts between susceptible and infectious people, which is what we're computing from the mobility data, or an estimate of it. And so what this means is that since beta is the only thing that we're calibrating to match the case data, it encodes effectively everything about the epidemic that affects transmissibility. That includes mobility, but also other factors that might be affecting it, like mask wearing or physical distancing or the weather or whatever it might be, right? So now that we have that, and we calibrate it to match the observed cases, once we have that, then we can say, how much does the change in mobility explain the change in the beta time series? Right? So it's a fairly simple idea. So we do a multiple linear regression with beta as the dependent variable and all the interaction measures we had as the independent variables. And we smooth the data over 1 week to get some, avoid some of the noise. And we get actually quite reasonable results. So we see that in many cases, the R squared, which is the fraction of the variance that's explained by our independent variables, is quite high. So mobility contributes quite a lot to the spread of the epidemic. So here are some actual results. These are the results for the worst 5 counties that we have, right? And so you can see here that the calibrated beta from the model is like this, and the estimated beta from the linear regression is like this, and it's not a great fit, but you'll see that where there's a peak in the expected beta, the estimated beta also shows a little peak. It's just not as high as the actual peak. So there's a lot of variance that's left unexplained. Many cases you sort of, you miss this dip over here, but you catch these other dips over here, catch the dip over here. So even in the worst performing counties, there is some signal there. That's sort of just by staring at the data, you get that feeling. And then here are the fits for the best 5 counties. And here we are doing actually quite well. You miss a few things, like there's actually a peak over here, which we missed. Our estimated version just keeps dropping over here. But on the whole, you're getting the large peaks in the data, right? So with this observation, we said that, even though the mobility data doesn't directly perhaps help you forecast exactly what the number of cases is going to be, maybe we can do something a little better. Maybe we can just say that we are interested in understanding if there's going to be a surge or a peak in cases when we look at the mobility data. Can we just use it to forecast that? Because ultimately, that's what matters. We don't need to know the exact number of cases, but if we know that, oh, there's a surge coming, we can act the contract ahead of time. So here, we use a standard algorithm for identifying peaks from the case data from SciPy. And it just looks at the maximum height of the curves, which we set to be twice the average case rate, and the minimum distance between peaks, which we set to be 14 days. And so it does a fair job of identifying peaks. You'll see it misses a few, like there's no peak found over here, but there's a peak found over here. And it misses some of these small peaks. That's because of, I guess, the maybe the average is too high, or the time window is too low, or whatever. But it does a reasonable job of finding the peaks. And so we set up a supervised learning problem that said, can we use the interaction metrics for 1 week of data and with some additional descriptors of the counties, and have it output a 1 if there's a peak anytime in the subsequent 3 weeks, or a 0 otherwise. So if we can get that much of a look ahead, that's enough time to actually act and try to prevent this. And we evaluated on data from April to October of 2020 for all the 50 counties with the 5-4 cross-validation. And the results are actually quite encouraging. So the best performing model, which was XGBoost, gives us high accuracy and precision and recall. And the average cross-validated F1 score is about 87%. So I think this is quite a nice finding that we can do something with the mobility data, even with all the noise and such in it. And really, in my opinion, this is an underestimate of what can be done with the mobility data, because it's a particular data set that we used with its own biases and some particular features that we sort of came up with to extract from it. And with all that, we're able to get this good a result. So presumably, somebody else could come up with some smarter set of features and do even better, or find a better mobility data source and do even better. So I think this is quite encouraging. So I'll stop there. I think I'm about out of time, maybe over time. I'm sorry for that. But thanks for inviting me. And this workshop has been really interesting. I've learned a few things that I'm going to follow up on for sure. And I welcome